all the way up to big things and even web applications themselves. So you can do an entire web application all in React. And when you build web applications, you need to worry about something called routing or URL routing. So when you go to any given web page, it routes to the correct component that's going to render out some content, right? The content part and the rendering part, that's completely separate to how it's actually routed. Well, maybe not completely separate, but it is separate from how it's actually routed. Now, luckily for us, there is an actual third-party component that we can use called React Router. This makes routing URLs unbelievably easy, and that's what we're actually going to be talking about in this one. So if you want to get more in depth here, please let us know in the comments, because we're really sort of scratching the surface, but this should give you enough to actually build a full-on web application using React Router and obviously React. And then the next part of this is just diving in deep on your own on the documentation and just trying these things out. And of course, if you get stuck or lost, let us know in the comments. Help each other out, because that's what it's all about. Okay, wow, that just rhymed. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into this. First thing that we want to do is npm install these two items here. So React Router and React Router DOM. We want to save those into our project so that when we open up package.json, it's going to look something like this. Now, the versions might change a little bit, the docs might change a little bit, but a lot of these concepts probably won't change because of how routing typically is handled in applications. So the first thing that we want to look at is where the routing happens, right? This is actually the critical piece. And then the next critical thing is how to handle dynamic routing. So where routing happens is typically on app.js, right? So I've got this whole block here, and this is actually how the routing happens. I'll explain what's going on line by line, but the main thing here is I could absolutely put this in another component and call it like routing or URL routing or custom URL routing, but I don't want to get it too confused with some of the built-in things from React Router DOM. So if you're going to be typing along with this, you're going to want to import those few things. And these other components are things that I built by default. There's nothing really going on with them, right? So we've got our static router. We'll talk about link in a moment, but it's really just rendering out some basic content. Not found, again, just rendering out practically nothing. And then finally, dynamic component. This one actually does some things that we'll get into a little bit more, but still not routing or not actually rendering out that many things. But I do want to bring those in because our React Router actually will handle these things differently based off of a different path or a different URL, and that's the point. So if we scroll down and we take a look at this, we've got our browser router, but you also notice that there's a nav bar here, right? So I actually have the nav outside of the router because you don't necessarily need to have it inside of the router. You don't need to render out the navigation inside of the router or any given component in the router, which makes this also very nice. So the main thing here to understand is this is the part that's actually dynamic. This is the part that will change based off of what the path is. So let's actually just take a look at what this looks like. So if I do npm run start, I can actually see this basic example, right? So by default, I have a page not found on my index page. If I click on that navbar, it really doesn't take me anywhere. But if I go to about, it takes me to this thing. It says a content that doesn't change very often, right? It changes based off of the path, but it's not dynamic based off of the URL other than the path part of it, right? So if I type out ABC here, it gives me this page not found. I'll explain why it's doing that in just a moment. But then if I also do posts and say some slug, I hit enter and then it says some slug right here in the content. This is a dynamic route, like the actual content inside of the component will change based off of the path. Right? So it actually changes based off of the path. So those are the main key things here. There's a lot more depth that we could go in. I wouldn't say a lot more, but there definitely is more depth that we could go in to understand this further. But that's the key portion of this routing. So let's take a look at it a little bit closer. Now I mentioned that when I went to about/ABC, it didn't actually work. And that's because we did exact path and we put it inside of this route. And then all it does is render out that one static route component. This could be any component. I'm just have some examples here, and that's what's happening. The next thing is our dynamic route component, right? So I actually passed in a slug and I changed the slug, and that's based off of this right here. Now you don't have to call it slug, you could call it whatever you'd like, but you would have to update your component to match that. We'll get into that in a second. And then finally we have this page not found thing, right? So like any other route that we went to, it would render out this not found. So if I went to, just some random stuff here, it's going to say page not found. And I don't have an index page. I don't actually have a root page. So if I wanted a root page, I could just do something like this and save that. And then what's going to happen is it's going to change everything, and now I've got my root page there, right? So obviously I could change the component to being home page or whatever, but the main thing here is it's not really changing based off of the route. So that would be a static route, right? It's not changing based off of the path or the route. So this is where the switch statement comes in. So the switch statement actually takes in what that URL is, and it looks for a route that matches whatever that path is. And if we have a default set, like I do, this is the default, that's where it's going to go, right? And in my case, it makes sense to have a page not found, like rendering component. This is not actually an error. It's not showing any errors, but it is a page not found. So I could write 404 error to kind of emulate what that would be doing, but it's not actually an error. Like there is no error here. We are rendering out that the page is just not found because it doesn't match any of our paths. That's completely optional to you if you want that to happen. Okay, so let's actually take a look a little bit deeper into that dynamic route component. Okay, so typically on components, what you'll often do, especially if they're dynamic, is you'll have a component did mount method built in. You'll grab whatever the parameter it is that you're using. So in this case, I have slug in here, right? So in app.js, I have slug here. Now, if I change it to ABC, I would also need to change this to ABC and any other place that I'm using that actual parameter. So, ABC and ABC. I would have to change it everywhere to make sure that dynamicness is still coming through. Of course, I'm going to leave it as slug because practically speaking, that's what you'll be doing. So in this dynamic route, that's where you would actually do something like perform lookup on this actual slug. So this would be, grabbing data from your API. So you would do a REST API call here. This method would be on the component somewhere else, and it would actually do the lookup, and that's how you would do it. And then your render stuff, all of these things would be a little bit different than what it looks right here. If you want to see this in action, and specifically in action with Django, check out our Reactify Django project. It's pretty long, but it will show you exactly how to do this. Okay, so the next thing is understanding that we can use history, right? So with routing or going to different pages, it starts to create a navigation history. So the reason that you see this force refresh here, this has to do with if it's using an older version of a browser, right? So if you can't actually use the browser history, you have to automatically refresh the page. With the React router, you don't have to refresh the page. It does it automatically for you. Like it doesn't need to refresh the page. In other words, when I click on a link, the page doesn't actually refresh. It dynamically routes to that new component, right? So it's not refreshing that page. It's just rendering out that component, which is really nice. Now, of course, if the history doesn't actually have that, as in if the browser doesn't have that ability with this push state API component of the browser, if the browser doesn't have that, it will re-render it much like it would, without using JavaScript. So if I refresh in here, that's sort of what I'm talking about. Okay, so that is talking about the refresh, and this would also happen inside of our component, right? So you can use this same idea to redirect them somewhere. So for example, if we do a lookup for our slug, right? So we hit our API, our backend, and nothing in there shows this slug, we might want to redirect the page somewhere, and that's where this comes in, right? So this history, we can actually push it to a different page, or like the not found page, right? We can push it somewhere else. And if that support history is not there, then we can just use a long-term supported thing from JavaScript, which is window.location. That will actually reload the page and go somewhere that it's actually working. So that's another thing that's sort of important to know. Well, not sort of. It is important to know when it comes to doing some lookups in a backend, because every once in a while you'll look up something that just doesn't exist in the backend, right, or in the database. So something like that probably does not exist. So more than likely you'll want to redirect it to a page not found. All right. So the last thing that I wanted to mention was you can actually render out the path based off of some condition as well, as we see in here, right? So this is the last portion of it. The render method, much like any other render method inside of any given component, can be used as a fat arrow, right? So this thick arrow here is actually doing the rendering for us, and then it's quite literally just going through a conditional statement that is saying, hey, if it's logged in, then we will send them a redirect. So again, that's React Router DOM. Otherwise, we would render out some sort of component. I mean, more realistically, it would be a login component, but I just use static route component as a default. But this is allowing us to have our routes to be even more dynamic within the routing itself, right? So within the browser routing itself versus doing it in the component itself, right? So I just mentioned how you could do it in the component, and then I showed you how you would do it inside of the app, right? I did mention that it was based off of an API, not finding something, but this would be another way to reroute them based off of that same exact condition, right? So this, in theory, would be able to happen here as well. You wouldn't do it. You don't want to have these things being too big, but it is kind of cool to know that, hey, if they're not routed, if they're not logged in, we can do this. There are some more advanced uses of this, but I'm not going to go into that right now. The last thing to note is the links, right? So I had some links in here that are actually routing to different components themselves, right? So this is in lieu of using an A tag, right? So instead of saying a href equals to, posts dynamic, instead of doing that, you use the link. And the reason we don't use the A tag is so it doesn't reload the page. Link won't do that. Link will just render out that component in place of the current one. But it still adds the history. It still does all the things that you expect it to do in the browser, but it uses this thing called link. And it does that same thing inside of this dynamic route component. Like, we didn't do anything different, right? We just showed you a couple examples of where you'd use link. Now, if you try to use link outside of the browser router element, then you'll have an error. It's going to tell you you shouldn't or can't do that. That's why our navbar doesn't actually have the browser router stuff. So if you don't mind that the navbar may change, we can put the navbar inside of this browser router, and what happens? Hey, the router must only have one child element. So we just don't want to do that, right? We leave it right here. There's probably a way to make this work where you would have it on all of them inside of the browser router and use link and all that stuff, but that's getting a little bit more complex than what we need here. So I'm just doing some basic example on how to actually use React Router, and that's it. Now, if you want to see more, please let me know in the comments below. I'm going to be covering a lot more stuff in React. Sometimes there are these third-party package things. Sometimes they're more basic stuff. But even if you're like still learning and you're like, hey, what the heck? Why am I jumping into something seemingly more advanced? I would say that this is important because you want to understand how to use this in building a web application. And right now is actually a good time to test that out. So make